Good day all, and welcome to the June edition of the Artificial Intelligence at Work series of seminars, jointly organized by the Institute for Information Management and DAMA Australia. My name is Vladimir Videnovic, and it is my pleasure to host this webinar today. At the start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout our beautiful Australia and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And as I'm joining this session from my home office in Canberra, I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land where I stand today. Just a few words about the organizations that are behind this series of webinars that we have been running nearly a year now. I represent the Institute for Information Management, or IIM for short, a professional association that provides forums for information management professionals to discuss trends, leading practices, and solutions and interesting topics like the one we have tonight for managing important information assets in our organizations. With us today is Andrew Smiles from our partner organization, DAMA Australia, who will say a few words about his organization. Andrew.
Thanks, Vlad. I'll just remember to unmute myself. So DAMA is the Data Management Association in Australia, and we have about chapters in each of the capital cities. We've been doing a lot of webinars, of course, but normally we have sort of monthly meetings. And so, we're very pleased to be in with this Artificial Intelligence at Work seminar series with IIM, because of course, even Gartner says that data management is one of the 5 fundamental components of use of AI and machine learning. So I hope you enjoy this webinar and attend a few more afterwards. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Andrew. Now, our AI at Work session today is sponsored by Magia Solutions, and I would like to introduce Atai Erginai from Magia, who is going to give tell us a couple of words about his organization. Atai.
Thanks, Vlad. Like Vlad said, everybody, my name's Atai Erginai, and I've only just recently joined Magia within the last 6 weeks or so to lead the newly established marketing cloud practice. And for those of you that haven't heard of Magia, we're a Platinum Oracle partner specializing in the implementation of cloud technologies, as well as providing consulting services. And we're extremely proud to be sponsoring this event, as the subject is really, really close to our hearts. To give you a background, Magia was established back in 1998 and has grown significantly over the past 20 years or so. And now we've got experts in areas such as enterprise resource management, human capital management, customer experience, and now marketing. Magia has a very diverse client base, ranging from higher education, government, whether that be at local, state, or federal levels, transport, utilities, retail, list goes on. We also have staff that operate across the country, from Perth to Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra, Brisbane, Adelaide, all over the place. Over the past 12 months, I should say, under the stewardship of our CEO, who Vlad will be introducing shortly, we have seen year-on-year growth exceeding 60%. We've also been able to grow the number of employees we have by almost 100%, all the while maintaining that growth during the global pandemic that most of you would have heard of. From a day-to-day operational point of view, at Magia, our core business is to work with our clients to assist them in the implementation, adoption, and ongoing management of the platforms they have purchased. What we think sets Magia apart from the rest is that we are specialists and can operate in a nimble environment, producing high-quality work, all the while keeping an innovative mindset. When it comes to artificial intelligence, despite the current hype that surrounds it in the corporate world, all of you that are in attendance today know that AI technologies have been around in various forms for some time now. Magia provides organizations with the skills and expertise in both first and second generation AI technologies to help support complex business operations and in integrating these technologies into existing IT environments. For us at Magia, the next steps would be to become the #1 Oracle partner in APAC, closely followed by global domination, whether it be North America or Europe. Before I now hand back over to Vlad, we at Magia thank all of you for attending this event and really hope you enjoy the content. Thanks, Vlad.
Thank you, Tai. And now let me introduce you to our key speaker today. That is Surend Dayal, Chief Executive Officer at Magia Solutions. Now, Surend is known as a mastermind behind the Australian company Ruleburst, which was acquired by Oracle Corporation back in 2009, which was the year where I had the pleasure meeting Surend for the first time. Now, the software innovation that is now known as Oracle Policy Automation is used worldwide for modeling, automating, and optimizing implementation of policies, legislations, and complex business rules. After the acquisition by Oracle, Surend spent 10 years working for this major IT solution provider in a number of roles, most recently as the Vice President for Public Sector in Australia and New Zealand. Surend is also a senior lecturer in IT law at the Australian National University. One of his most recent achievements is that he just shared with me that he finished marking for the AI and Law Autumn course at the ANU. During this course, Surend received a lot of very interesting views from his students on the legal and ethical perspectives of AI, which I hope he's going to share with us today. Without further ado, Surend, welcome to the AI at Work seminar.
Thank you very much, Vlad, and welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today. Very nice of you to attend and hear me pontificate about the potential future for AI and some of the ethical or legal things that we might have to think about with that. So as Vlad said, yeah, I've just come off teaching and we did it. Normally we do it as a kind of full semester course at the ANU in AI and law, but because of COVID, we actually ran it as an intensive course over, I think it went for about 4 weeks with a lot of Zooms to the class. But definitely very interesting, you know, and the students, I guess the current students coming through the universities, you know, they're growing up in a world where AI is here already. And it's not so much if, it's more what are we going to do with it and what should we do with it? And some of you may be aware, but the ANU actually has now a whole college or a whole section of the university devoted to that kind of cross-fertilization between the computer science discipline, where AI comes from, and the humanities. And, you know, as we move into a future where AI is here, I think it's actually really important that we take a broader view of the good and the bad things that could be done with AI. And, you know, basically, if you just have a bunch of computer scientists in the corner figuring out, well, what should we do with it? I don't think you're going to get good outcomes. You know, clearly you want people from other disciplines, whether it's law, the humanities, you know, the more conventional sciences. So just to begin with, I thought I might just start by trying to level set a bit and talk a little bit about, you know, what is possible today? What's the current kind of state of the art? Because it's certainly possible and is happening right now that we're applying AI in many, many more contexts than has been the case historically. And, you know, there's a lot of factors that feed into that. I remember when we first started doing the research for the software that became Oracle Policy Automation, you know, we were looking at different reasoning strategies and we were very constrained by things like, well, how fast can the CPU go? You know, how much memory can we use to make a decision? Nowadays, those kind of constraints are gone. And you know, those sort of barriers, particularly in the cloud world, are being lowered all the time. And when you add that to Moore's law, which, you know, basically says that every 18 months or so computing capacity doubles, when you add cloud scalability, where you can just add CPUs or add memory as you need, and, you know, most of the big providers now provide a deep learning platform or an AI platform, it's just possible to do so much more than has ever been possible before. And that is not going to slow down. You know, that's today. In 5 years' time, we'll be able to do exponentially more again. Okay, so what can we do today? I guess at the moment, the big thing is, you know, we've made this move from conventional machine learning, where you need a whole bunch of data scientists to be able to classify things, be able to get things into the right shape, that then you can feed that to a neural network, and then the neural network can make a decision. So, you know, that you get a human basically to train the network, and you know, that takes a fair bit of work, that takes a fair bit of skill. The sorts of people who tend to do that, you know, data scientists are not, they don't tend to be mainstream people. It wouldn't be a lawyer doing that. It wouldn't be an accountant doing that. It would be a, you know, a hardcore boffin, basically. But more recently, you know, we can now do deep learning, where you don't just apply one AI technique to solve the problem. You can apply multiple techniques to solve the problem. And in many instances, you don't even need a human to do the training. You can kind of let the machine train itself. And you know, you can sort of see that from the diagram here, where in a machine learning model, okay, you have the human doing the feature extraction, training the network, then you can decide whether something's a cat or not. In a deep learning model, you might not even need to do that. You just feed a whole bunch of data in and apply a couple of different vectors to it in terms of the you know, the algorithms that you're using, and the software itself will say, okay, now I know that's a cat, and by the way, it's a Russian blue cat. I mean, locally in Canberra, I can give you an example of that locally here. Full disclosure, I'm on their board, but Trellis Data locally is one of the best exponents of deep learning that I've seen globally, and that's why I joined their board. And they're doing some amazing things with deep learning right here in Canberra, which I'm confident they'll take to the world. So that's, you know, that's kind of where we're at now with the current technology that's available. And what that means is you can go from having to have a bunch of data scientists in the corner who kind of know what they're doing, figuring out the problems, to mainstream people being able to use and apply the technology. And again, it's reminiscent for me of when 20 years ago, when we commercialized what back then was just a rules engine. Nowadays, back then, that seemed like AI. Well, today it's way more sophisticated than that. So just an example, a lot of you may be familiar with this. This is a, you know, reasonably well-known example globally. If we take AlphaGo Zero. So, and the thing with AlphaGo Zero, the thing that was special about it is that basically, you can see here from the infographic, it first of all did better than all the other versions of AlphaGo. So the original version of AlphaGo, done normally, you put a bunch of heuristics in, you get humans to train it, you get it to look at great players, games, that kind of thing. AlphaGo Zero, the only programming here was we program it with the rules of Go, and then we get it to play itself, and we have two algorithms. We have one that basically evaluates the games and whether they're going to win, and the other one, which is the more conventional kind of machine learning neural network. But you put those two together, and in 40 days, it's the best player in the world by some margin. And, you know, some of the things that came out of that is patterns that we'd never thought of as humans. So for those of you who are familiar with Go, you know, the objective is to surround your opponent's squares. Well, all these patterns emerged from these games that people had never thought of. And they're quite beautiful, really. So, you know, that's really where we're at with the state of the art. And for that small use case, the computer is better than the human, better than any human in the world, better than any human that's ever been. And it's only going to get better. And, you know, that's kind of the reality of where we're at now. So in a world where you can have machines be better than humans at certain tasks, that means we have to think about it. We have to think about that from an ethical point of view and a legal point of view. There's no point in trying to wish it going away or trying to get rid of it, because it's here to stay. It's like fighting the tide. Okay, so let's just talk about a few different use cases then. So we know we've got the tech. What can we do with it? Now the first one I'll have a chat about is autonomous vehicles. So, you know, obviously popularized by Tesla, which is now the most valuable car company in the world. And it's the most valuable car company in the world, not because of the machines that it makes at all. It's the most valuable car company in the world because of the AI and because of the data that drives the AI. Because the data from every Tesla in the world pretty much goes back into, you know, like the central repository to then figure out, well, how do we keep improving it over time? But on the flip side, when we're in this world where you can drive autonomously and fully autonomously, and I'll get to the different levels of autonomy, well, what does that mean? So I'll just present you, now this is a fairly conventional kind of moral ethical dilemma. So you've got a trolley or a tram in Australian terms. You know, obviously the Americans call them trolleys, but the so you've got a person like you, and you've got a tram that is going to run over 5 people, and you have the choice. You can take an action and move the tram, and it's not going to run over the 5 people, but it is going to kill this other guy standing here on the track. But what would you do? So an ethical dilemma. And, you know, for a human, we apply our own thought processes, our own upbringing, our own morals to kind of try and make that ethical decision about, you know, do I take the action or not? So what do you do there when you're programming a car at scale to make decisions like this in fully autonomous mode? You know, does the car continue on and hit the 5 people, or does the car veer off and take out the other person? And then when you kind of add to that, maybe a more realistic scenario for a car, does the car take an action which sacrifices the life of the driver, the person who bought the car, but saves the 5 people who are on the road? And they're the sorts of things that we start to need to think about when we're going to apply these technologies at scale. So if we look at Tesla, as I said, what makes it so valuable? It's definitely not the cars. It's the AI in the cars, and it's the data that Tesla's collecting. They're the things that make it very valuable. And in the self-driving world, they talk about these different levels of driving automation. And what I'd put to you is that it's fully technically feasible right now to have full automation. You can drive from Melbourne to Sydney in a Tesla, not touch the wheel, have a sleep, read a book, whatever. The barriers to rollout are not technical, they're primarily legal and ethical. They're primarily, well, what do we do in the trolley situation? Who makes the decision about what should happen there? If something does go wrong, well, who's liable? Is it the driver who bought the car? Is it the manufacturer of the car? Does it just become an insurance problem? And most of the legal analysis of this would suggest that it's really ultimately the liability or the responsibility of the people who made the car. So, it's kind of like a product liability issue. Now, that obviously presents some challenges maybe for the car company. Probably more so it's the insurers, because ultimately, if you're a car company, you insure yourself against that. And, you have some companies like Volvo, for example, trying to take a leadership position there and saying, well, we'll take strict liability. We'll accept responsibility for whatever happens. If the vehicle's being driven fully autonomously, we'll take it on. There are other things you can do, though, with autonomous, like safety features. So drunk driver testing, speed enforcement, a lot of those compliance constraints can actually be built straight into the AI. And the other question here that I think is interesting is that would the roads be safer overall if the majority of vehicles are autonomous and they're all doing the right thing, they're all following their programming guidelines? Is that going to be safer, or is that going to be not as safe as the situation we have at the moment, where it's humans? And humans, of course, we're human. We make mistakes. We're not infallible. So in some jurisdictions, we're starting to see some regulation being introduced, but the law is still a fair way off catching up here in this space. Now, Vlad, I think you wanted to do a poll maybe while we're going through. Do you want to push one of those out to the audience?
Yes, it's on the screen now. If you can quickly please answer. What is the use of AI in your organization?
Very good. Thank you, Vlad. Okay, so that first use case, civilian use case, obviously there's a lot of utility in being able to have autonomous vehicles. There's some ethical issues we've got to think about in terms of scaling that. The next one that I'll bring your attention to is maybe a little bit more controversial. So AI and warfare. And, it's already the case that AI is being used in warfare, in the battlefield. Similarly to the driving scenario, people talk about 3 different levels of automation. So you can have human in the loop. You can have human controlling it, actually, where it's just augmented by AI, human in the loop, and then human out of the loop, where it's fully autonomous. And one of the challenges there is, well, what happens when it's fully autonomous? So for example, the US Department of Defense defines a lethal autonomous weapon system as a weapon system that, once activated, can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator. So once you set that thing off, that's it. It's like you've pushed the button on the bomb. That's it. It's over to the AI. The AI is the one that's going to select the targets, that's going to kill people, that's going to, you know, take the actions in war. So that obviously leads to the question of, well, what rules should govern armed conflict? There are some legal protections. So, you know, there's the various Geneva Conventions, the additional protocols to those. There's a lot of human rights law, the rights of the child, the Hague Declaration, various conventions on the rules of war. There are also weapons review standards. So the ultimate responsibility for the use of any weapon does sit with the state. But then there's at least two other people in that chain that you would think about. One would be the person who authorizes or controls the use of the weapon in the field. So if you're a soldier on the ground and you've got a bunch of drones with you that could kill your enemy, well, you're the one who then unleashes them. What's their level of responsibility? And that could go right up the chain of command, with the state being the ultimate arbiter. The other actor here that we might want to think about is the manufacturers of the weapons. So, you know, the military industrial complex in the US, for example. So on the legal side, there's definitely some issues there to think about. On the ethical side, well, the main countries who are developing these capabilities, not surprisingly, are the US, China, Israel, Russia, and South Korea, all of whom are combatants in various forms around the world. And as a general proposition, it's the higher income producers and then lower income consumers. So you could take a strong position and say, well, we don't want these weapons at all to exist. But if the bad guys have the tech, shouldn't the good guys? This question actually came up at Google itself. Some of you may be aware of this, but Google was supplying a lot of the AI platform for the US Defense Department. And when a number of its employees became aware of this, they actually said, we don't want to do this. And so Google has consciously backed off providing that technology to the US Department of Defense. And they actually kind of have a statement in their values, essentially, to say, we're not going to do that. Well, they won't, but someone else will. And the current kind of weapons review system was established for traditional weapons. So it doesn't really fit for AI. So we definitely have a question there of who should be accountable for the development of those legal or moral rules if we're going to start using AI in combat, which will happen. Okay, turning to something a little less grim than the use of AI for combat, medical applications, the opposite. So using AI to help save lives, you know, a much more noble cause in my personal opinion. And there's plenty of areas of application here. So the drivers are generally around reducing costs, improving quality, improving equity, and improving access to health. And broadly, people tend to divide it into virtual systems and physical systems for medical AI. Pretty much anything involving image recognition is a good use case for AI, and there's a bunch of those in medicine. So, you know, radiology, skin cancer diagnosis, Alzheimer prediction when you're looking at brain scans. And in all of these areas, we're getting rapidly to the point where the computer's better than the human. The doctors probably don't like to admit that, but it's the truth. And whether or not it's today or in a couple of years' time, we'll get to that point, because you can train an AI on 1 billion images. So with Alzheimer prediction, for example, the computer already can detect the likelihood of Alzheimer 10 years earlier than a human looking at a brain scan. So obviously heaps of potential here. And on the physical side, you've got robotic systems for surgery, remote surgery where you can't get to people in various parts of the world. So then this again raises a bunch of legal and ethical considerations. Obviously there's a lot of benefits. So very significant reductions in cost, increased access to medicine in countries like the US where they don't even have proper healthcare. That's obviously pretty important. For some use cases, the accuracy, as I said, is likely to get much better than that of humans. And a big space here that we're only really just at the edge of is genomic. And, that's probably going to be one of the places where we find the cure to cancer. So you apply AI with genomics. It's going to be really interesting to see what comes out of that. But on the risk side, lawyers, of course, they think in terms of risks and issues. Well, what happens if it goes wrong? Who's liable? Again, I would argue it's product liability, so whoever created the system. There's also a bit of a confidentiality issue here because you need a lot of data to train these systems, and the data comes from patients. So you have to make it clear to patients if their data is going to be used, that it's going to be used to train a machine. I think there's definitely a human thing here though. Would you trust your life to a machine? Most people would feel more comfortable with a human making the decisions about their life and their well-being. Another big thing here is, and we'll get to this particularly when we look at legal applications, is a lot of AI to date has been a black box. So you can't explain, you can't figure out, well, how did you come up with that answer? And I think in the medical field and definitely in the legal field, that's going to become important. You can't just say, well, the machine told me. You need to provide some rationale for the answer. And yet companies like Trellis are definitely attacking that problem and coming up with explainable AI. In some areas in medicine where there can be contractual issues here too, because a lot of medicine could be elective, for example, IVF therapy, where you're paying a fair bit of money to have the AI applied to help you with your health issue. All right, the next area that I'll move on to inevitably is the legal area. And this ranges from very basic AI for intelligent searching right up to automating judgments. And of course, lawyers don't like to think of themselves as indispensable. So some of the drivers for thinking about using the tech are particularly reductions in cost, time benefits, which leads to an access to justice kind of argument, that the cheaper you can make it, the more expansive you can make it, the more accessible you can make it, the fairer the system is inherently for people. Once we start getting into this space, then we really need to think about, is it possible for a computer to understand and or display emotion? Because you certainly expect emotion to play a role. I mean, it's the same in warfare. And it's not today. I mean, even the state of the art today is still just patterns. It's still just maths, crunching through big volumes of data. The philosophical question is it possible that if we get the machine complex enough, that it could read emotion, it could display emotion in the same way a human could? Another big one that comes up in this space is bias. So, and you guys might have seen when they first released Cortana or the earlier versions of the Microsoft chatbot, it rapidly became racist, and that was because of the people who were interacting with it. Well, it's the same thing in the law. If you train an AI, and this happened in the US, they had a compass system there for figuring out whether people were likely to offend. And of course, it came up predominantly black, underprivileged people. And that absolutely just shows the bias in the system over there, rather than whether those people are worse people than the white people who they were training the system on. I think in this field in particular, explainability is very important. You can't really expect people to accept an outcome from a system that is a black box. Particularly if you're going to make a judgment about them, if you're going to feed a bunch of data in and say, well, based on that, we're going to give you a sentence of 3 years, you need to be able to explain, how did you get to that answer? And I would suggest in this space, the key criteria that we need to look at for the use of the systems at scale are fairness, simplicity, affordability and accessibility. And there's a fair bit of academic literature on that. Okay, so just to round it up, we've just covered kind of 4 areas there where the tech is being used today, but there's heaps more. So it's being used in biosecurity for automated image recognition for invasive species, insurance and banking, credit scoring or market analysis, fraud detection is a big area, air safety, stopping go-rounds or doing evaluations of plane end of life. Recruitment, actually Amazon got hammered a bit for this one because they used AI in their recruiting and it turned out to be quite sexist. So you had a much better chance of getting a job at Amazon if you're a guy than if you're a girl because of the way the AI functioned. Expense management, and this is mostly an efficiency thing. So Oracle, for example, in its ERP cloud you just take a photo with your mobile phone, scans the receipt and then uses AI to figure out, well, does that look reasonable? Is that a reasonable cost? Is that a reasonable expense? Don't need a human to approve that. We'll just put it straight through. Social welfare, well, I guess the classic example of how not to do that would be robo-debt. But increasingly, I think AI will be used in social welfare, not necessarily to smash people, probably more on the other side, actually, to automatically grant welfare to people based on a trained neural network. Social grading is kind of a negative version of that China is doing already, and people might have seen some things on that where the government looks at how you behave in public and they then grade you socially and you get privileges or lack of privileges based on how well you're graded. So that's the kind of 1984 scary version. Policing, similar. There's cameras everywhere nowadays, and increasingly you can use AI to look at what those cameras are looking at and analyse it. Political targeting. Many of us would be familiar with the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Well, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's heaps more that you can do with AI to micro-target particular parts of society that you want their vote or not to vote. And then the final one, space exploration. It's something that we're seeing quite a bit of now. And now that we've got the Australian Space Agency, I guess it's topical here. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that you need to do in space where you can't have a human. Well, okay, let's get an AI to do that. Okay, that's enough spiel from me. Thank you everyone for listening. Vlad, did we have another poll? Did you want to do that before we get into questions? Or
Can I first of all share results of the first poll?
very good.
I don't know, Surend, if you have comments on that, but it seems that according to our audience, and my apology goes to phone callers, there are 3 of them that are not seeing this, but majority of others are not currently in the process of adopting or just experiment with AI.
Right, okay, but then there's quite a few who are. Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, going to the next poll. About your personal view on AI. And panelists are able to vote as well.
I did vote.
Good. Okay, well, at least we don't have anyone indifferent. People are either concerned or interested and excited, which is great, I think. Okay, so while we finish the polling in a couple of minutes' time, I'm going to remind everyone that they can ask Surend questions. If you use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, please beware, we have, because of the number of attendees, we had to disable chat and raise hand, but you can certainly use Q&A to ask Surend any of the questions you have. We do have one more of the comment than question to start with. So someone in our attendance has just wanted to comment that it's not just about explaining how AI arrived with the decision. It is about evidence and the decision being defensible. Not sure if you have any comments on that, Surend?
Well, I think it's both. Certainly the decision needs to be defensible and you need to be able to look at the evidence. But ideally, you should be able to see, well, which factors were the ones that were important in the AI arriving at that conclusion. And that's doable nowadays. It's being put into the AI.
Now, you were talking about state of the art, and we know that these days there are some more certainty in airplanes landing themselves rather than humans. But what are your thoughts about machines and their ability to think today?
Well, today they can't think. Not today. They look like they're thinking, but they're not really thinking. They're just applying math to solve problems. The interesting question for me there is, philosophically, do I think we'll get to the point where they can think? I do. We're just not there yet, but I do. I think eventually, I don't see any reason why an artificial mind, constructed however, couldn't reach the same level of sophistication as a biological mind.
Okay, next question is from Carl, who's asking, how long until we solve the trolley problem in your views?
Yeah, I don't know. For the autonomous vehicles to work, they have to make decisions like that. About, okay, in situation X, what are we going to do? I don't know what the right answer is, but they have to come up with some sort of decision for that. A lot of my students, when they were doing their essays on this, they suggested some rules, like it should be the least loss of life, etc., etc. It's just hard to put those into practice.
And a question from Marilyn, what is the answer to the trolley tram dilemma?
I don't know. Rationally, you'd sort of think, well, we should do it for the one person instead of the five. But one of the problems with that dilemma is you've actually got to take an active action to make that happen. If you don't do anything, it'll just keep going on its way. So you're actively deciding, you die, they stay alive.
Excellent, thank you. So Shane Connor is asking if there is any work done on ethical decision-making using pattern recognition and maths. And if so, could AI be applied to the ethical work of developing and applying AI systems? That's
a great question. I'm sure there is. That would be a good question for Genevieve, actually, the ANU, because it could be applied in that space.
Next one from Carl, how much is it really about evidence and decision being defensible, or obviously it has to be in government, versus organizations who do use AI being allowed to try it and fail in the market when they use it and it doesn't work?
I think it depends on the use case, as you say. Like if it's a government, you need to be able to explain how you arrived at things. In the market, yeah, you can try what you want. Depending on the use case. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
Of course, especially if there are lives at stake.
Yes.
Another question, surely the decision would have to be explainable if it is to be defensible in a court of law.
But for legal applications, 100%. You couldn't, it doesn't work.
Do you have any examples in legal of AI being used?
Yeah, so in the US, they have a system called Compass that has been used to predict offenders and things like that. They've tried using it as a judgment system in things like divorce settlements to decide how you're going to split up the proceedings. So there are definitely people trying to apply it in the legal field.
It is my understanding that there are a lot of organizations that started with the big AI dreams and case studies, only to recently start looking at more basic things, like from legal perspective, maybe as simple as looking for, document classification so they can easily find examples and
well, that use case is pretty well understood and fairly heavily used. Yeah, so yes. Discovery, auto discovery they call it, to the point that in the US, in some instances, you would get queried as to why you didn't use auto discovery. Because if you really want to look at a million documents and figure out which ones are relevant to the case, that's a good use case for AI. That's much better for a machine to do that than.
And it's not just in legal, as you would agree, in the legal domain. Another question from the audience, is the trolley problem a real problem?
Well, I don't know if it happened in real life, but it's a very well-known ethical dilemma that is posited.
Okay. From your perspective, what has the reception in the legal community been like for advanced users of AI?
Yeah, that's a good question. That I think it divides on generational lines. So most of the current law students and the younger generation coming through kind of accept that it's here and we just need to figure out how best to use it. For the older generation, it's generally no way, you can't replace lawyers. What are you thinking? You're nuts.
Okay. And do you think the legal system is up to date enough to be able to cope with the, progress with AI?
I don't, not at the moment. I think it needs some reform, particularly in some of these areas we've been looking at. We need people who understand the AI, which is one of the reasons why we run the course at the ANU. Ideally, you want lawyers or people in that field, ethicists, philosophers, to have an understanding of what's possible and then start to make some decisions about, well, how do we regulate that, or where do we want to put the boundaries? I wouldn't leave it entirely up to the computer science community to make the ethical decisions for how we're going to apply AI in the world.
Agree, especially after you see them playing some of those interesting games.
Yeah.
Another question from our audience, would the trolley tram example be different if it were a child on the track? So in other words, not a matter of numbers.
Absolutely, I think it would. And that's what I'm saying, where it's hard to come up with rules because you can think of an exception to most rules. And maybe you could train the AI and look at 1 billion accidents that had happened around the world and see, well, what did the human do? But whether or not it was the right response is another question entirely.
Agreed. Next question is, do you have any comments on Woodside Petroleum's using AI to predict which contracts need legal expertise input?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I'm not across what they're using it for, but that would be a reasonable application of the technology. I do have friends in the legal profession who do use AI a bit like that in some of the more advanced firms to make decisions like that. I mean, probably the best example I've seen of that is one of my friends' firms does a lot of M&A, mergers and acquisitions, and they use AI to try and figure out which contracts are risky and that need to be looked at, particularly in the case of an acquiring company acquiring another company, because that's a big area of risk for the acquirer, is what legal risk are you taking on. So I could see it. I could see it being helpful for that. Whether it would be better than the humans, I'm not sure.
According to this gentleman, they have been using this AI practice since 2015.
Yeah, right. It'd be interesting to see whether they think it's been better or worse for them.
No problem. When it comes to the future, where do you see that legal and ethical side of things need to focus on? Where do you expect next generation of AI to hit those legal and ethical problems that we may not necessarily analyze today?
I think there's going to be heaps of areas as the AI gets better, as it gets closer and closer to a human. I think it'll be particularly in the areas we looked at today: medical applications, legal applications, anything where today we think of that as being a human thing that only humans should do. I mean, already some of those things we're looking at, we're talking about some major professions there being disrupted. The legal profession, the medical profession, any knowledge-based profession where traditionally you think you need a human with all the heuristics they can build up, all the experience they can build up to do that, where now you can train a machine like AlphaGo to do it in 40 days.
So clearly we are living in information age where information is power. At least we even saw that in recent pandemic scenarios that we have been all exposed to. Where do you think a legal and ethical perspective comes into play when it is, protection of information and misinformation sources from, utilizing AI to either break into systems or turn information into wrong information?
Well, I think that's why it's so important to look at the ethics of it and the legality of it. And ideally, governments step in there and regulate and start to make some decisions about what do we condone, what do we not condone. The classic one at the moment is, which has been around for a while, is the whole cybersecurity issue in Australia, where there's clearly state actors looking to get information and break things. And it's absolutely a case of they've got robots, they're using bots, they're using AI as for offense. That means on the defense, you need AI. It's very difficult to do. I think the analogy I saw when I was at Oracle that I think Larry used actually was, it'd be like you facing up to the Terminator with a pop gun. You're going to lose. If he's got a robot, you need one.
And on one person doing defense, there are probably hundreds trying their luck with offense, and government probably, and other organizations need to use AI even in decisions. Do we need to worry about this particular piece of information or attack or whatever the case might be? Next question from the audience is, there situations where it is unethical to use a human because the AI is better? That's an interesting question.
That's a really good question. I think we'll get to that point. The medical one is a perfect example. So if the computer is going to give you a much better decision on whether a melanoma is likely to kill you or whether you're going to get Alzheimer's in 10 years than a human, surely you want to use the AI.
And clearly AI can help with triage, but when you have humans, although humans have bias as well, making decisions, who needs help, who needs to survive the traffic accident or whatever the case might be, it is, although much more efficient to do it with a machine, it's that ethical side of things. But on the other side, if you have machines that have been programmed by humans, it is natural to expect that bias would be part of those machine learning processes, at least implemented consistently. So machines maybe having some bias, but consistently applied.
Well, that ethical issue comes up a lot, whether it's in the legal area, the medical area, any of the areas we're looking at, is the machine will reflect what you train it on. So if there's bias inherent in that, and humans have bias too, particularly in the legal area. If you look, the US in particular, you look at individual judges, they have bias, and if you just analyse their decision, you can see it. You just feed their decisions into an engine, you can see it.
Okay, well, I don't know if anyone from the audience still have a question or so, or your last comments to finish the session, Surend, while we wait for the question.
Yeah, I think that's been a good set of questions, actually. So my last comment to the whole audience would be, AI is here. It's incumbent on us, particularly thought leaders or in this space, to think about the ethics, to think about the legalities, to think about, well, how is it actually going to work in the world? We don't want to abrogate that decision.
No worries. Thank you, Surend. I hope that the rest of the audience will join me in thanking Surend for spending time with us and bringing this very interesting topic. I'm also like to thank Magia Solutions, who have supported making this seminar happen, and also thanking our partnering organizations, DAMA Australia and IIM, for making this. Keep us tuned. We will inform you about the next session, about next exciting topic to bring to you. Thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you at one of our next events. Bye for now.
Thanks very much, Vlad.